Margaret Davis, 74 years old, stands frozen at First Community Bank in Riverside, California, as two police officers slam her against the marble counter. Her arthritis-ridden hands are wrenched behind her back. The branch manager points at her, shouting about fraud. Cold metal handcuffs bite into her thin wrists. Through the window, she sees them, five leather-clad bikers from the Hells Angels, engines idling outside. They're watching. One dismounts his motorcycle, her late husband's motorcycle club, the family he chose. They've come to make their monthly deposit. They see everything. Margaret enters the bank on an ordinary Wednesday morning, wearing her church clothes and carrying her worn leather purse. She's been banking here for 32 years, since she and her husband Raymond bought their home in Riverside. The sun streaming through the tall windows catches the silver in her carefully maintained hair, and she walks with the measured pace of someone who has learned to navigate the world with both dignity and caution. She approaches teller station 3, where a young white woman named Brittany looks up with immediate suspicion, her eyes narrowing the moment Margaret reaches the counter. Margaret requests to withdraw $8,000 in cash to pay contractors fixing her roof after last month's storm, the one that tore shingles loose and left water damage in her attic. Brittany's expression shifts from neutral to hostile within seconds, her lips pressing into a thin line as she examines Margaret's withdrawal slip with exaggerated scrutiny. She asks for Margaret's ID 3 times, each request more pointed than the last. Holding the driver's license under the light as if it might be counterfeit, turning it over repeatedly, squinting at the photo. She calls over her supervisor, Derek Chen, a nervous 30-year-old who always seems to be sweating regardless of the temperature. Derek takes Margaret's ID and bank card to the back office without explanation, leaving Margaret standing at the counter while other customers glance at her with varying degrees of curiosity and pity. Margaret waits patiently, accustomed to this treatment, but always hoping each new encounter will be different, that someday the color of her skin won't automatically trigger suspicion. Other customers, all white, move through their transactions smoothly, depositing checks and withdrawing cash with nothing more than a smile and a greeting. 15 minutes pass, then 20, and Margaret's feet begin to ache in her good shoes. Derek returns with branch manager Patricia Holloway, a severe-looking white woman in her 50s who has worked here for 8 years and who Margaret has always found cold and unwelcoming. Patricia's voice carries across the lobby as she loudly questions whether Margaret really has an account here, whether this is really her ID, whether she's trying to commit fraud. The words echo off the marble floors and high ceilings, ensuring every person in the building can hear the accusation. Margaret, humiliated but maintaining her composure, explains she's had this account since 1993, that her husband, Raymond, died 3 years ago after a brief battle with cancer, that she receives his pension from the Veterans Administration and Social Security, that she's simply withdrawing her own money to pay for necessary home repairs. Patricia's eyes narrow further, her lips curling slightly as she announces the signature doesn't match, that the photo looks different, that something about the whole situation seems suspicious. She declares they're calling the police, pulling out her phone before Margaret can protest. Margaret's heart races, a flutter of panic rising in her chest, but she maintains her dignity, asking to speak to the bank president, Mr. Morrison, who has personally handled some of her accounts and surely knows her. Patricia refuses, curtly, already dialing, her fingers stabbing at the numbers with vindictive precision. Outside, 5 Hells Angels bikers pull into the parking lot for their monthly business deposit from their legitimate motorcycle repair shop, Thunder Road Customs, which has banked here for 15 years. The club has a standing arrangement, coming in on the first Wednesday of each month to deposit the previous month's cash receipts. Among them is Marcus Thompson, known in the club as Reaper, Raymond Davis's best friend and writing brother for 40 years, a man who stood beside Raymond through 2 tours in Vietnam and every major moment of life since. Marcus is 6 feet 3 inches tall, 240 pounds of muscle and experience, his graying beard and weathered face showing his 56 years, but his eyes still sharp and observant. As Margaret protests her innocence with quiet desperation, Patricia presses a silent alarm installed beneath her desk, and within 3 minutes, 2 patrol officers burst through the glass doors with hands hovering near their weapons, immediately targeting Margaret without asking any questions, without assessing the situation, without giving her any benefit of doubt. Officers Jake Hutchinson and Brad Connolly enter with aggressive energy that fills the bank lobby like an electric charge. Jake, 38 years old, with 17 years on the force and a history of excessive force complaints that were never sustained thanks to his union representative and sympathetic supervisor, scans the room with predatory intensity. Brad, 29, follows Jake's lead in everything, mimicking his movements and attitudes, hoping to build a similar reputation for toughness. Patricia immediately points at Margaret with a theatrical gesture and declares loudly that this woman is committing bank fraud, attempting to steal $8,000, and has become hostile and threatening when questioned. Margaret hasn't raised her voice once, hasn't made a single aggressive movement, has simply stood at the counter trying to explain herself. The officers don't ask for her side of the story, don't request any documentation, don't investigate the situation beyond Patricia's accusation. Jake approaches Margaret with heavy footsteps that echo ominously, and he demands she put her hands on the counter immediately, his voice sharp and commanding. Margaret, frightened but trying to comply, moves slowly because of her arthritis, a condition that makes her joints stiff and painful, especially in her hands and shoulders. Jake interprets this careful movement as resistance, as defiance, as exactly the kind of behavior he expects from someone he's already judged as criminal. He grabs her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her thin flesh, spinning her around so forcefully that she gasps. Margaret cries out in pain as her shoulder, which she injured in a fall last year and which still hasn't fully healed, sends shooting agony through her body. She tries to explain she has arthritis, that she's moving as fast as she can, but Jake shouts at her to stop resisting him, his face close to hers, his breath hot and angry. Brad moves to her other side, boxing her in, and together they force her hands behind her back with unnecessary roughness. Margaret's right shoulder, compromised by the old injury and weakened by osteoporosis medication that makes her bones fragile, protests with waves of pain that make her vision blur. She gasps again, tears forming in her eyes despite her determination not to show weakness. The handcuffs click shut, fastened too tight around her small wrists, the metal biting into skin and pressing against bone. Margaret tells them quietly that they're hurting her, that the cuffs are too tight, that she can't feel her fingers. Jake tells her she should have thought about that before committing fraud, his tone mockingly cruel. He begins reading her rights in a mockingly slow cadence, emphasizing certain words as if she might be too stupid.